The way Monday Night Raw ended last night, we have what I thought was an incredible match between Keith Lee and Drew McIntyre. I really think that each week it feels like Keith Lee is finding himself and where he fits on the main roster. People took it very hard. I took it very hard. Seeing Keith Lee, who had reached, it's an understatement to say that he had reached the pinnacle in NXT. You're talking about a guy who had not only pinned the top star in NXT for the last year plus in Adam Cole, but had both the North American Championship and the NXT Championship. I mean, as celebrated as a singles competitor can be in NXT was Keith Lee. He was popping up behind Finn Balor. He was shoulder checking Adam Cole into the fourth row, just going meme crazy. And he shows up on Raw, and his attire is changed, and his music is changed. And look, he's not the dominant force that he was in NXT. But he's also not dominant. He's just not the guy that you're looking at going like, well, clearly this is the number one person on this roster. He's not the number 20 person on the roster. He's just not number one, and that's what he was in NXT. So I believe that every week that has progressed since that first week, where even I was questioning it, oh, no, don't tell me that Keith Lee is going to end up on Raw and it's just going to get lost in the shuffle of all people. Keith Lee, a guy who's so much bigger than the average man and can even do more than the average big man. Keith Lee, a man whose glory I was basking in not weeks ago. Tell me he's going to get lost in the shuffle. And I worried about it. But I feel like every week that has gone by, Keith Lee has proven more and more what he's capable of. Keith Lee is finding himself on the main roster, and he is slowly but surely getting himself to the place that he was in January of 2020 at the Royal Rumble, staring down Brock Lesnar. At Survivor Series November 2019, shaking hands with Roman Reigns. I understand sometimes as wrestling fans, we are impatient. There's a feeling that as soon as Keith Lee shows up, it should just be, here we go. Let's go. Keith Lee is here. Let's get back to that place. But really what we were being told in November of 2019 and January of 2020 is that this guy has the potential to do great things. As wrestling fans, we have to be patient enough, cynical as we may be, to allow that potential to be realized. And that potential is being realized, I think, actually more quickly than a lot of superstars find their potential on the main roster. And the fact is that I believe that his stock has risen considerably. His stock is considerably higher today on Raw than it was the third week that he was on Raw, which is a very good thing. And I believe that his stock has risen even further after last night's main event. I thought the Keith Lee-Drew McIntyre match was a phenomenal match. I thought the Spanish fly off the top rope that Keith Lee was able to pull off. There were some moments in that match that looked terrifying and dangerous. But I guess that's part of the style of Keith Lee. When you've got guys the size of Keith Lee, and you've got Drew McIntyre in the ring, and they're going at it like a couple of cruiserweights on Nitro in 1997, you're going to have some dangerous moments. But as long as everybody's okay, I'm okay. It's up to somebody else to slow people down, not up to me as a fan. I loved the Keith Lee powerbomb onto the edge of the table, and it was done with such force that the table collapsed. The whole match was great. The match was so great that it left me. In October, I was saying that what WWE needs to do is get us to a WrestleMania where we've got champion versus champion, Drew McIntyre versus Roman Reigns. That is your WrestleMania main event, and that is a main event that is not only going to be the biggest wrestling match that you could possibly present to the United States of America and the world as a whole, but it would prove beyond the shadow of a doubt who the number one person is across World Wrestling Entertainment. Now, there is a hiccup there. Maybe WWE doesn't want to declare a number one. Maybe as long as there is a Raw roster and a SmackDown roster, it is in everybody's best interest to have two number ones. There are two shows. Unless you're going to have a unification title match and the champion is going to go between the shows, like when the draft first happened in 2002, then maybe. But if you're not going to do that, then okay, maybe you don't want to declare there is one number one guy, and that's the show he's on. Therefore, we now know that's the number one show. Maybe you don't want to do that. Okay. All right. Because I've already gotten to another place. As of 2 weeks ago on SmackDown, I see a WrestleMania main event of Roman Reigns versus Daniel Bryan. And it could be an amazing story to tell. It's the story of Daniel Bryan's career. It's the story of Roman Reigns' career. And we make it an even more heightened story by making it a career match, a Universal Championship versus career match. If Daniel Bryan wins, he is the Universal Champion. If Roman Reigns wins, Daniel Bryan will retire from the WWE. This is the match that I want to see main event WrestleMania on the SmackDown side. Officially, beyond the shadow of a doubt, today as I talk to you, this could all change tomorrow. But today, as I speak to you, the match that I want to see main event WrestleMania on the Raw side is Drew McIntyre versus Keith Lee. I want to see Keith Lee turn on Drew McIntyre, and I want to see it happen badly. I want to see Keith Lee become bloodthirsty. I want to see Keith Lee become ravenous. I want to see Keith Lee become somebody that realizes that nice guys finish last. And he has all of the physical abilities to destroy everybody on the Raw roster. So it's time to start destroying people and not doing it with a smile on his face and not doing it to impress fans. I believe that a strong Keith Lee heel turn will lead us to a point where eventually Keith Lee can be your number one good guy, theoretically, hypothetically. And I think somebody that's the size of Keith Lee, that can do what Keith Lee can do, is going to be in a better position in WWE. With the way WWE storytelling is done, I believe that he will never be the number one guy if he is a good guy. I believe that he could go on that road as a bad guy, as a villain. And I think that if he is a villain, then we've got a real good story to tell between Drew McIntyre and Keith Lee. And if you have a match that is on par with what we saw on Raw, probably better since it's WrestleMania, and you add to it a blood feud involving two people who used to be friends, you got yourself a WrestleMania main event for the ages. And then you've got two giant WrestleMania main events that involve WWE homegrown talent. Talent that you will only see on WWE, letting the world know you must watch WWE again. Because we tell stories like Drew McIntyre versus Keith Lee and Roman Reigns versus Daniel Bryan. Don't pick one show, watch both. Because look at these fabulous main events that we're presenting to you for WrestleMania. We've also got Cardi B versus Lacey Evans. We've got your celebrity involvement, but our main attractions are grown right here in the McMahon farm. The roots, the foundation from WWE. And that's something that we haven't seen all that much in WrestleMania. Main events involving part-time guys. Main events involving celebrities. It's good. It's got its benefits. But at some point, we need to tell the world the real superstars are the ones that are going to be on your television sets every Monday and every Friday. And those four, the four that I just mentioned, can get you there. So I honest to God, I'm watching that match, and I see Keith Lee kind of get a visual nod from all the legends that were on the stage, and I see the match that happens, and I'm sitting there going, like, on paper, it's never going to happen tonight. But what if? As I'm watching the match, I'm thinking, what if? What if Keith Lee wins the WWE Championship tonight? There was at least a possibility that it could happen. And the reason that possibility existed is because of the match that we saw. I wasn't shocked that Drew McIntyre eventually won, of course, but The fact that the possibility was there is enough to hook me and say, I had a great time watching that match. That was a fabulous match. Drew McIntyre gives Keith Lee the fist bump. Keith Lee leaves. And instead of ending the night on, my God, the match that we just saw from Keith Lee and Drew McIntyre, that old familiar music plays. And here comes Goldberg. As the legends part like the Red Sea, Goldberg walks to the ring to confront Drew McIntyre. Goldberg levels accusations against Drew McIntyre that I have never heard from and have no idea where they came from. Goldberg came across like a very insecure old-timer. I don't know where the idea comes from that Drew McIntyre has been disrespectful to legends. 3 months ago, I watched Shawn Michaels, Ric Flair, Big Show, and Christian, all legends, respect Drew McIntyre so much that they helped him win an ambulance match and retain the WWE Championship against Randy Orton. None of them felt like they had been slighted. Shawn Michaels superkicked Randy Orton off the roof of an ambulance for Drew McIntyre. Ric Flair learned to drive an ambulance for Drew McIntyre. Ric Flair doesn't drive. He sits in the back of limos. He doesn't pilot the Lear jets. He's got a lounge in the back where every local fan is riding. Space Mountain. Woo! But he learned to drive an ambulance for Drew McIntyre because he supported him. And Drew McIntyre seemed grateful for it. I never noticed Drew McIntyre being disrespectful to the legends. And then the accusation gets hurled at him. Yeah, and you think that you can beat all of us. And I'm looking around and I'm looking at that thing, looking at that stage, and I'm like, yeah, I as a fan, I believe that Drew McIntyre could win a one. After I just watched the match that he just had with Keith Lee, Drew McIntyre winning the match that he just had with Keith Lee, yes, I looked at that stage and said, at this point in their careers and in Drew's career, there is no reason that as a WWE fan, I should believe that any of those people can beat Drew McIntyre. Goldberg said, you're dead ass wrong. I could beat you. And I'm challenging you. He said, it's not a demand. It's a challenge. I'm challenging you for that title at the Royal Rumble. And Drew McIntyre, in just the greatest response ever, he goes, mate, it would be like fighting my dad. Seriously? And I'm just like, that's awesome. Finally, somebody said it, you know? Goldberg turns around, he goes, oh yeah, and he shoves him. And Drew falls down on his keister. And then Raw goes off the air immediately. Now, clearly there were some timing issues, you know. Reminded me of Bret Hart eating the super kick, except Shawn finding out that Bret Hart ate the super kick after Raw went off the air. In 97, that was a huge issue between the two of them because nobody saw Bret eating the super kick, so the wrong guy ended up going out on top. WWE did immediately put out the video on like their Instagram and everything. And I'm sure the Hulu version has the full version where they didn't get cut off because Drew McIntyre pops right up and goes forehead to forehead with Goldberg. And they do the old Hogan Warrior, you know, Argh! And Raw goes off the air. And look, people weren't happy. Fans on social media weren't happy. Now, clearly there is an interest in Goldberg. Let's not pretend that everybody just hates Bill Goldberg and nobody cares. Because every number would tell you, every metric would tell you that people care. Television ratings would tell you that people care. Pay-per-view buys or views or however they count them now that they're on the network would tell you that people care. We remember the Goldberg stuff. For better or worse, people do care, right? However, There are a lot of people that are starting to get real annoyed by it because of the choices that are being made. Now, look, I may have some prejudice built in. I was a WWE kid, okay? No point during I was an NWO fan. I'm for life, and I'm also Wolfpack for life. But even as an NWO fan, I grew up on WWE. It's the promotion I started watching. I don't remember a time that I wasn't watching WWE. When Nitro came in, I was like, screw those guys. That's not cool at all. Leading up to WrestleMania 12, all the Billionaire Ted and the Huckster and the Nacho Man skits, I was like, yeah, you tell them. Macho Man Randy Savage was my favorite wrestler of all time until the minute he walked onto the set of WCW Saturday Night. After that, never again. I mean, I still like Macho Man. He's still the man, but not my favorite wrestler of all time. I'll tell you, this is shoot. This is a shoot, not a work. I'm one of those cool wrestling podcasters that uses the lingo like I'm in the business. It's a shoot. In 1995, I wasn't a fan of the Macho Man Randy Savage anymore. I stopped that in 94. He left WWE November of 94. I was done with him. As of 1995, I was running on Diesel power, baby. Diesel became my favorite wrestler. That's how into WWE I was. And when Diesel left WWE, I moved on from Diesel because I was a WWE guy. When Goldberg first debuted on Nitro, I was like, who's this Stone Cold ripoff? I was one of those guys. Goldberg's style was completely different than Stone. The only thing Goldberg had in common with Stone Cold was the black trunks, the bald head, and the goatee. And by the way, it's a good look. I may use it someday. But, not the trunks so much, but the goatee and the bald head. But, still, I was like, Stone Cold ripoff, cheap imitation, not interested, sir. As Goldberg rose and all my friends started to be into Goldberg, I was like, Goldberg sucks. I was a Goldberg sucks guy back in the day, back in the long ago, because I was such a WWE fan. And Goldberg became a huge star. And Goldberg was a WCW homegrown star. Goldberg ruined the narrative that all WCW was a blank check. Goldberg ruined the narrative that the only reason WCW is successful is because they paid WWE guys a bunch of money to come over. Goldberg upset the whole thing because he was homegrown from WCW and he became one of the biggest things in wrestling. But I wasn't a fan. I've never looked forward to a Goldberg match. When Goldberg came over to WWE, I was like, big deal. I was on Hunter's side. I was on Triple H's side. Good. Have everybody beat Goldberg. I'm happy to see it. I was a Gilbert fan. And, you know, when Goldberg shows up and has the Goldberg-Brock Lesnar match at WrestleMania, I liked. It was a good match. It was great. I didn't mind the Goldberg-Dolph Ziggler stuff. I wasn't happy when Goldberg beat Kevin Owens. I was not happy when the match with The Fiend and Goldberg happened, and we don't really talk about that anymore. And, you know, I'm not one to sit there and go like, well, this is the move to make. If I was in a WWE writer's room, I would not be the one that was like, what about Goldberg? No. Because here's the thing about Goldberg. People are like, oh, why is he such an awesome dude? And the answer is because 25 years ago, he was the man. It's about maybe not quite 25 years ago, but 21, 22, 23 years ago anyway. Over 20 years ago, over 2 decades ago, Goldberg was the man. And that's why he's in the position that he's in WWE right now. So that feels like it'd be difficult for me to explain to somebody. If Stone Cold Steve Austin was the champion, and Bob Backlund showed up, I wouldn't sit there and be like, oh my God, Bob Backlund might get this thing. I mean, when Bob Backlund did show up, he was younger than Goldberg when he showed up. And I was like, what? WrestleMania 9, Bob Backlund thinks he's going to beat Razor Ramon? It's never going to happen. And guess what? It didn't happen. Because why would you do that to Razor Ramon? Look, Goldberg is an entity, right? Goldberg is a commodity. Goldberg is worth something. A victory over Goldberg means something. A Goldberg match is something that's going to garner attention. However, a Goldberg loss means something too. When I look at this as a potential match for the Royal Rumble, I am not in the school of thought. There are some people that are just dead set against the whole thing because they say a Goldberg-Drew McIntyre match takes away an opportunity from a younger guy, and that's not fair. That's not my opinion at all. Because if Drew McIntyre beats Goldberg, it puts Drew McIntyre on a different pedestal. And it makes whoever Drew McIntyre faces after he beats Goldberg, Drew McIntyre is now a bigger superstar. And you could say, no, he's not. This won't help Drew McIntyre at all. And that's not true. A victory over Goldberg does indeed help Drew McIntyre. A victory over Goldberg does indeed cement the fact that Drew McIntyre is a beast. You could make the argument that Drew McIntyre is unstoppable if he's able to beat Goldberg. And if that were to happen, then the next person that faces Drew McIntyre, be it at Elimination Chamber in February, or be it his WrestleMania opponent, is now facing an opponent that is greater for beating Goldberg, and therefore more worthwhile, and therefore they get a bigger rub by facing him. So you are actually creating the potential for even greater opportunities. When Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker's streak, it turned Brock Lesnar into a completely different beast. And when somebody beats Brock Lesnar, when Drew McIntyre beats Brock Lesnar, it becomes a much bigger deal because of the road that Lesnar has been on that was set off by beating The Undertaker's streak. Drew McIntyre beating Goldberg is not that impactful. But it is impactful. And it would cement Drew McIntyre. I am okay with the match happening if Goldberg gets his head kicked off his shoulders. Drew McIntyre has to beat Bill Goldberg convincingly. No victory roll, no backslide. Goldberg has to eat a claymore, and Drew McIntyre has to beat him middle of the ring, 1, 2, 3, to the point where there is no need for a rematch. To the point where Goldberg isn't asking for anything else. And if that does happen, if we go to the Royal Rumble and Goldberg and Drew McIntyre duke it out, and it ends with a claymore being shoved down Goldberg's throat, all's well that ends well. I'm good with it. Especially if we go from there into a program with Drew McIntyre and a villainous Keith Lee. Ugh. Mwah. Beautiful. However, there is a great fear. The great fear is that at no point did we get the Roman Reigns-Goldberg WrestleMania match that clearly was desired by the WWE. Goldberg became the Universal Champion in February of last year, putting him on the road to WrestleMania to face Roman Reigns. That would have been Roman Reigns' crowning moment. However, Roman Reigns, to the last minute, was not able to compete at WrestleMania, and it ended up being Braun Strowman's crowning moment. Didn't work out perfectly for Braun Strowman by any stretch of the imagination. But again, all's well that ends well, because Roman Reigns not participating in that match and taking the amount of time off that he took off led to the return of Roman Reigns in the form that we see him now, which is by a mile the greatest Roman Reigns that we have ever, ever, ever seen. The fear that has set in with people, and you can see it now, it's clear as day, is that Goldberg will beat Drew McIntyre at the Royal Rumble, and WrestleMania will end up being a champion versus champion Goldberg versus Roman Reigns match. This would also make it so that the winner of the Royal Rumble isn't involved. Somebody on my Twitter said, well, what if there's a triple threat? And it could be a triple threat. Keith Lee wins the Royal Rumble, and then you've got Roman Reigns versus Keith Lee versus Goldberg in a championship unification triple threat. That's possible too. Or anybody who wins the Royal Rumble. I mean, if it's going to be a triple threat, it probably should be Keith Lee. Obviously, Drew McIntyre wouldn't be included in that because he wouldn't be in the Royal Rumble match because he's already the champion. And I don't know if you've heard, but he's got a match against Goldberg at the pay-per-view. That would be horrible. And it would be horrible for Drew McIntyre. Ultimately, it would mean that Drew McIntyre lost the title twice within a year of having it. He lost the title to Randy Orton, and then he lost the title to Bill Goldberg. That would be cataclysmically bad for Drew McIntyre. That would upset me. It would upset me greatly. I think it'd be bad for Drew McIntyre. It'd be bad for WrestleMania. Honestly, it'd be bad for Roman Reigns. Because I tell you right now, if Bill Goldberg wins that title from Drew McIntyre, even if it is a triple threat, Roman Reigns is not going into WrestleMania as a bad guy. Roman Reigns is going into WrestleMania as one of the best good guys of all time. And maybe that's what this is all about. What about that? What if, on some level, the WWE wants to turn Roman Reigns into a good guy? And their thing is like, well, what if we get the fans so pissed off that Goldberg is champion that they have no choice but to cheer for Roman Reigns? And while that's possible, you'd literally be sacrificing Drew McIntyre to do it. And that is not something you should do. Drew McIntyre has broken the mold of fans hating whoever the big good guy is in the company. He broke that mold. And he's also been a convincing champion at a time where there's been no fans in the audience. I think that would be a horrible thing to do. I think we have to be optimistic as we look at this. If you think too much about the fact that Goldberg might beat Drew McIntyre, you'll be in a bad mood from now until the Royal Rumble. And you can't be. You can't live your life like that. You can't live your life on such negative terms. All we can do, all any of us can do, is sit there and hope beyond hope that logic prevails and that Drew McIntyre kicks Goldberg's head off of his shoulders. If Drew McIntyre kicks Goldberg's head off his shoulders, you'll get a fabulous ovation for Drew at the Royal Rumble, if there's any people there. If not, you'll get a virtual fabulous ovation for Drew. You'll set him up beautifully going into WrestleMania, and Goldberg will have been used very effectively as a credible, believable threat to Drew McIntyre's championship that just went down to a Claymore. And Drew McIntyre is unbeatable. And then you could go into a match against Roman Reigns, or you could go into a match against Keith Lee, or there's many stories you could tell. I mean, you really want to turn people on their head. You have Goldberg beat Drew McIntyre, and then The Miz cashes in on Goldberg, and people are like, I don't know how to feel anymore. I just am confused. Thanks for watching, guys. That was a clip from a podcast that came out exclusively at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling for all the Not Sam shills. Of course, the Not Sam Wrestling podcast drops for free every Monday on Apple, on Spotify, wherever you get audio podcasts. Totally separate from that, a completely different show. Not Sam Wrestling, the WWE Network show, is available every single week on the free version of the WWE Network. So check out both of those shows for free. And if you need even more content like what you just watched, then go on over to patreon.com/NotSamWrestling and become a Not Sam shill today.